Today I'm going to show you how to make this really cute detachable back collar. It looks like this when it's done, and it's a really great afternoon project and a good way to use up scrap fabric. You need only about a 24-inch by 24-inch square of fabric to be able to cut this pattern out, and it prints on 2 sheets of paper. There are only 2 pattern pieces. It sews together super quickly, and I would say it's good for most skill levels. It's a better second or third project than first project though, so if you are just starting out, I do suggest sewing some things to get you acquainted with sewing basic lines, seam allowance, and also sewing curves, because this does have these curves right here. They're not that difficult, but if you've never done pivoting using your sewing needle and your presser foot, that may be a bit of a challenge for you. So when you print the pattern, you just need to make sure you click print to actual size or print to actual scale in the print settings, and then check to make sure that the scale square on each page of the pattern prints out at 1 inch by 1 inch. Other than that, it should be a pretty easy project, great for lightweight to medium fabrics, although if you wanted to use a heavier fabric, you could with some pattern modification. To make this project, you will of course need the pattern. The link is in the description. You'll need pins, a hand sewing needle, matching thread, something to mark your fabric with. I like chalk or a heat erase pen, paper scissors, fabric scissors, your fabric, which should be light to medium weight. You can, depending on your layout, use about a half yard or even scraps, but if you're in doubt, a full yard is always great. And you'll need some lightweight fusible interfacing. You could use medium weight if you wanted a really stiff collar. And you'll need one closure of your choice. I'm using a button. I suggest one that's less than 3/4 inch in diameter. You could also use snaps, Velcro, a hook and eye, ribbon ties. Any of that would work. It all depends on the look you're going for. The first thing you'll need to do is print out your pattern. Make sure the scale square is 1 inch in size on both pages. You should be able to get this by printing actual size where it says in your printer settings. And then use your paper scissors and cut out all around your 2 pattern pieces. So now we've got our 2 pattern pieces. You're going to have one pattern piece that is your collar body and one pattern piece that is your collar stand. You're going to take this to your fabric, which should already be ironed, and you're going to cut 2 copies of this on the fold and 2 copies of this piece on the fold. It doesn't matter how you've got it oriented, horizontally or vertically, so long as this edge is on the fold and it's going straight across either the grain or cross grain. I used my chalk to transfer my pattern lines onto my fabric, and now I'm going to use my fabric scissors to go cut that out. So now that I've got my pieces all cut out, you should have 2 of these collar stand pieces. They'll look something like that when you unfold them. And you should have 2 of these collar body pieces, which should look something like this when they're unfolded. Now I'm going to go and cut 1 each of my collar body and collar stand pieces out of my interfacing. So now you should have a copy of your collar stand and a copy of your collar body cut out of your interfacing. Take 1 of your fabric copies of your collar body and 1 of your fabric copies of your collar stand, and we're going to apply interfacing to these. Lay out your body piece wrong side up, and then we're going to take our interfacing and see which side has the little glue dots on it and lay it glue dot side down on top of your collar piece. It doesn't matter so much if the very edges don't line up, because we're going to trim those seam allowances anyways. And you're going to take your iron on an appropriate heat as indicated by the package directions and fuse your interfacing to your collar piece. I neatened up my edges and then went over it again with the iron to make sure that the interfacing is really fused on there. Then I flipped it over, and on the interfaced side, I used my pattern and my heat erase pen to mark out those 3 pivot dots on each side of my pattern, because I find it a lot easier to see the markings on this interfaced piece than on the uninterfaced piece with chalk. Then I repeated the same steps as before to interface my collar stand piece. The next thing you're going to do is take your collar body piece and you're going to lay it right side up, and take your uninterfaced collar body piece and lay it right sides together, pin all along this outside edge, and then we're going to sew along this whole edge, leaving this bottom notched part open. My machine is all threaded up using a color of thread that goes with my fabric. I'm using black thread here, and then it's set to a normal straight stitch using a small to medium length. I'm going to sew this up using a 5/8 inch or 1.5 centimeter seam allowance, and I'll show you how to pivot once we get to the first pivot point. It's a little hard to see here, but I'm coming up on my first pivot point. I'm going to use the hand wheel to bring my needle down into the fabric in line with my pivot point. Then I'm going to lift up the presser foot, pivot the fabric around the needle, put presser foot back down, and then sew really slowly so I can get that curve nice and even. So if you took your time, you should have nice smooth lines where your curves are, and you should have 3 points. 2 of them are going to be quite sharp, and then the last one's going to be a little dull. Now we're going to need to turn this inside out. In order to get really sharp edges, what you want to do is find your interfacing's edge, and then you're going to peel it away from where it's stuck to your fabric, and you're going to cut it really close to your stitching, making sure you don't accidentally cut your stitching. So peeling it off should look something like that, and then take your scissors and go around really carefully and cut it just up to your stitching. A little closer than that. It's kind of hard to do while filming, but I'll show you the end product. Trimming your interfacing like this is optional, but I find it helps give me really nice crisp edges when I turn this out. The next thing we want to do is clip our corners. We want to get close to the stitching, but we don't want to touch the stitching. Snip off those ends right there, and then we're going to go in and trim our seam allowance and clip our curves. So how you're going to clip curves for these, since they are convex curves, you're going to trim little triangles out of them, again getting really close to the stitching but not getting to the stitching itself. I am just doing this one as an example. I like to trim my overall seam allowance down. You could also grade this seam allowance if your fabric is really thick and you're worried about bulk. But I'm going to trim all my seam allowances down to about 1/4 of an inch, and then I'm going to clip all my curves and show you what that looks like. So I misspoke when I said these are convex. They're actually concave curves. You can see how I've trimmed my seam allowance and clipped my curves. I also trimmed the corners for these other points. And now that this is all trimmed and clipped and everything, we're going to turn it inside out. You may want to grab a skewer or a pencil that has no lead in it, something like that, to help you poke out the corners. I'm going to be using a chopstick, but we're just going to turn it right sides out. So you're going to use the end of your pointy thing to push out your corners. Make sure you're not busting through your stitching, and use your fingers to kind of push and roll the fabric until those edges are nice and crisp, and we're going to press this really well. You want this to be as flat as possible. Once you've gotten this pressed absolutely as flat as it will go, and you've got all those points nice and pushed out, you can optionally top stitch around the edges if that's a look you want to go for, and then you are going to baste this bottom edge that we left open shut, using a long stitch either by hand or machine, just to hold it together and prevent these pieces from shifting around. The next thing we're going to do is attach the collar stand. So you have one interfaced collar stand and one uninterfaced collar stand. You want to attach your interfaced collar stand piece to the side of your collar body that has interfacing as well, because that's going to be our outermost layer. So match up your centers and any notches along this top curved edge of your collar stand. Pin the interfaced one in place first, and then we're going to flip this whole thing over and pin the uninterfaced one onto this right sides together as well to kind of sandwich the collar body between these two pieces. In order to ease the body piece onto the stand piece, you may need to put a few small clips just up to your basting in your body piece to allow it to stretch enough to accommodate the size of the collar stand. I've got this pinned up into a sandwich. You can see how I have my collar piece between my two stand pieces. Now I'm going to take it over to my sewing machine and sew all along this edge only, following the curve, going really slow, making sure that I'm not catching the points of my collar. Here I've pinned them out of the way so I don't accidentally sew over them, and taking my time to ease around these curves and really push and pull everything into alignment. So now your collar body should be sewn into a sandwich with your two collar stand pieces. I've trimmed my seam allowances, clipped curves, and now we're going to turn this whole assembly right side out. You can already see the collars starting to take shape. It should look something like this, and you're going to take your iron and press all your seam allowances down towards the bottom edge of your collar. So now that you've got that all pressed smooth, it should look like this on both sides. And now we're going to do the most difficult step of this whole process. You're going to take your collar body and kind of roll it up and fold it so that it can fit inside your collar stand, which you're now going to turn back wrong sides out and pin together along the bottom edge. So it should be kind of like a weird burrito. So once you've got that all pinned up, we're going to take this to the machine and sew along this bottom edge, leaving the space between your two double notches open. Be careful you're not catching any of the collar body that's caught up in this roll. If you don't feel confident in this, you can always hand baste it first to make sure your basting stitches aren't going to catch any of the inside collar before you machine sew it. It should look something like this. I've already trimmed my corners right there. I'm going to leave my seam allowances long, which is not normally what you do, and then I'm going to pull this whole thing right sides out again. It'll be easiest once you find the tail end of the collar. This can be a little bit of a struggle. If you have trouble with grip strength, you might want to try pliers to help you pull this out, but it should actually come apart fairly easily. And you see we have our stand and our collar, so turn the whole thing inside out, and then we're going to use our sharp object to poke out our corners again and press this whole thing. When it's all pressed out, it should look something like this. Make sure it's pressed really well and press in the edges of this gap we left open. Now you can either sew that gap up with your machine or you can hand sew it shut. I'm going to hand sew it shut using a slip stitch so that it's invisible, and then I'll come back when that's done. So now I've closed up the gap on the bottom, and the last thing you need to do is add a closure. I'm going to be using a button on this one, but you could also use snaps, hook and eye. If you decide to use ribbon ties, I would actually insert them when you're sewing up the collar stand, but that could also be a really cute look. If you find that you think the collar stand is going to be too short to go around your neck, or that this whole pattern is too small, you can scale it up before you print it out. You'll get a different scaling square, but it should be a bigger size and it should fit a little better. Or if the problem is just the length, you can, at the center of each pattern piece, you can add a strip of paper to make it go around your neck at a better size for you, because I know some people don't like tight collars, but this one is a little bit tight. So just try your collar on and then mark the point where you have overlap. For my collar, I've marked about a 1/4 inch from the edge, and that's where the end of my buttonhole is going to be. Like I said before, I'm using a button that is about a 1/2 inch, I would say, maybe a little smaller in diameter. I think this will look really cool. It's like a little red purple button. The finished collar will look something like this. It has its button at the front. It fits pretty tight around the neck, and it's a really exaggerated shape, but it's super fun, and I'll go put it on in just a second. And the pattern looks like this when it's on. I think it turned out really well. I'm very happy with it. Please let me know if you like this pattern or if there are any issues that I still need to work out in the comments section. And check out my Instagram, my TikTok, or my Etsy if you're interested in the other things that I do. I hope this project went well for you and that you have a great Halloween!